Today's guest is Jon Blair, founder of Grow CFO and former CFO at Guardian Bikes, a DTC brand that landed a deal with Mark Cuban on Shark Tank. Jon's journey is one of grit, patience, and scaling smart, from building a bike brand that reached 8 figures to now helping over 20 e-com brands get clarity on their numbers. Jon knows the power of blending finance with marketing and how profitability is the real growth lever. Today, we're diving into a story, his frameworks, and the mindset shifts founders need to make if they want to scale without losing sleep. And I have a laugh at that last one because I've definitely lost a lot of sleep, and you've helped me at Fresh Chili. So super grateful for you today. So for people, just to give them a little background on you, what pulled you into entrepreneurship so early, even like kind of with an accounting background? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, it's funny. People ask me that all the time. Okay, so funny enough, I was actually reminded of this recently. I was back in my hometown in Southern California just like 2 months ago, and I was actually working in my childhood bedroom, and I saw this pencil sharpener that had a sticker on it that says Hostile Skate Company, and that was the first company I ever started when I was in, I'm pretty sure junior high school. And
Yeah.
so I've been an entrepreneur at heart since I was a little kid. I started skateboard companies that made no money. I was a musician since I'm still a musician till this day, but I started playing when I was 5. I always wanted to be in a touring band, which I got lucky enough to do coming out of business school, and I ran the whole business side of that. And so like I've always been kind of like a self-starter, like pulling together a team, whether it's kids to go skateboard or build our own skate park or go play baseball, do a pickup baseball game. So I've always been that, like, let's create something out of nothing, right? And when I went to college, I was like, I honestly was pretty confused about what I should study. I just knew I wanted to study business. And I literally went in going like, I'm going to take the intro classes to every, sub-discipline within business, and then decide where to focus. And accounting and finance just spoke to me. The first time I took an accounting class, I just got it. The first time I took a finance class, I just understood it. But what I also knew was there was no way that I was going to go work for a Big Four accounting firm like all my buddies in business school were. And so
Right.
I took a little bit of a different path. And when I graduated, I immediately started working for startups. And so that's how I got, even though I studied accounting from day one, ever since I became an accountant, I always worked for startups. And funny enough, the first startup I ever worked for was Guardian Bikes.
All right, let's talk about that. That was kind of my next question, is like, what made you go all in on Guardian Bikes? Were you working a part-time job at how did Guardian Bikes what's the origin story behind it?
Okay, so this is actually this is a funny story in
Okay.
many ways. So I met Brian and Kyle, the two original founders, in business school. We all went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in the central coast of California.
Oh, that's a beautiful campus, by the way.
Yeah, great experience. And so here's the story. Actually, the first startup I actually really worked for was a company called Olin's Technology, run by a guy named Ron Merritt. And I was actually I hadn't even finished my degree yet. There's a Facebook post looking for a part-time bookkeeper for a startup electronics brand. Turns out this guy, Ron Merritt, is a guy who's been on the cover of Forbes magazine. And he has a background working in corporate America, running, like big customer service organizations for consumer electronics brands. Well, he's also an entrepreneur, and what he would do is go find these little white spaces in consumer electronics where big companies like Samsung and Sony were not focusing on this little niche. And
Right.
he'd design a product, and he'd go to China, and he'd get it made, and he would import containers, and he would sell them all around the country. And so I was his part-time accounting manager in my last year of accounting school, but he was also the judge of an annual business plan competition at Cal Poly called Innovation Quest. Guess who won Innovation Quest my last year of college? Guardian Bikes, which was then Sure Stop Brakes, right?
Okay.
And so Sure Stop Brakes, which is the secret sauce of Guardian Bikes, it's a brake that we have a patent on that prevents you from flipping over the handlebars of a bike. Brian the original founder and today the CEO of Guardian Bikes, entered that into the Innovation Quest contest, and my boss
Mm-hmm.
Ron Merritt was a judge, and they
Mm-hmm.
won and got
Mm-hmm.
like I think it was 10 grand for like prize to start the business,
Right.
and they needed a bookkeeper, and Ron Merritt was like, I know the guy for you, right? And so that back then I had hair down past my shoulders because I was playing in a heavy metal band. That was my real
Yeah.
dream. I was gonna go tour in a heavy metal band once I got my degree. And anyways, long story short, um, Ron connected me with Brian. I met him at a coffee shop in downtown San Luis Obispo, and he
Mm-hmm.
gave me this big stack of documents. It was like, we need our books done. And so over the course of several years, I was moonlighting for Guardian Bikes doing their books while they were going. Ron took them to China. They were meeting with supply chain partners, trying to figure out how to turn this prototype into like a real manufacturable product. And
Right.
so I did that for them for probably 3-4 years, maybe even 5 years. During that time, I
Mm-hmm.
went and toured in a heavy metal band called Fate's Demise. Did that for a year, put out one record, and was like, okay, I've had my fun with that. I'm going to go back in the business world. And around that time,
Yeah.
Guardian Bikes was starting to mature, or
Okay.
then it was still Sure Stop Brakes. And um, they weren't ready for me full time, but like every kind of few months, they needed a little bit more from me, right? And so I
Right.
went and held various head of finance, controller, CFO jobs for a number of early stage, fast growing entrepreneurial companies, some in
Yeah.
manufacturing, some in consumer products, and all the while being the moonlighting accounting manager for Guardian Bikes. And then in
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember the year. I want to say it was in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so sure, there was this pivotal kind of shift that happened
Mm-hmm.
for then Sure Stop, which was Brian and Kyle were working hard on getting these brakes, Sure Stop brakes, put on as many bikes as possible around the country and around the world. Um, there's millions, tens of millions of bikes that um, could potentially have Sure Stop fitted into the bill of material for that particular bike. But we ran into
Mm-hmm.
this issue where we were getting adoption. We were getting on tens of thousands of units, I think even hundreds of thousands of units. But it's not a viable business when you're selling a brake for $2 a piece. That's a couple hundred K a year in revenue, right? We need to get on
Right.
millions of bikes. What we started to find was big bike brands who were putting us on several models and getting adoption to the tune of tens of thousands of units. But then all of a sudden, like, we would stop hearing from them as much. And we're like, what is
Mm.
going on? And we finally got wind after doing some digging for months that it was because there was this issue internally with the legal counsel for these businesses that were saying
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, if we let this get on millions of bikes, but we don't put it on every bike, all of
Mm-hmm.
a sudden we can start getting sued for people flipping over the
Mm-hmm.
handlebars because people can ask in court, how come you put Sure Stop brakes on this bike, but not this one that I flipped over? And
Mm.
if the answer is because we wanted to save $1 per unit, we're going to start losing product liability suits. And so
Wow.
like, we started getting ghosted, and we
Yeah.
realized we had to take matters into our own hands. By the way, Brian Riley is leading the charge in all this, and he's like,
Mm-hmm.
we got to take matters into our own hands, and he's convinced we need to start our own bike brand to do that, right?
Mm.
And so the further we got down this path of starting our own bike brand, the more that they needed me to do the accounting and finance, right? Because Brian and
Mm-hmm.
Kyle are the marketing and product visionaries in that business.
Right.
And so we had been talking about for months, like, as soon as there's enough capital in the business, we're going to hire you full time. And so anyways, Brian decides, hey, I'm going to just try to go on Shark Tank. And so
Okay.
he goes and he applies to Shark Tank. It takes a long time. We did a
Yeah.
diligence package that I helped with 2 years before the company even aired on Shark Tank. So do
Wow.
this
That was season
diligence.
5, right?
No, season 7. It was season
Season
7?
7.
Yeah,
Okay.
season 7. Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Maybe I'm wrong. It could be 8. It was back in 2017. Um,
Okay. Okay.
but we did this diligence, and then like kind of every quarter or every few times a year, the producers would just check in with Brian, get an update. They're always
Mm-hmm.
looking for a juicy story, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in 2016, early 2016, Brian got the call like, hey, you guys, we're calling you to LA and we're going to bring you on set. And so I was still working for the company about 20 hours a week at that time. And
Okay.
so I had pieced together, that was actually my first fractional CFO firm, funny enough, is that like I was working 20 hours a week for Guardian, but I didn't want to waste my bandwidth on another full-time job. So I
Right.
left my full-time job and had them on as like a 15-hour a week client. And then I
Mm.
brought together another client. I had 3 clients to fill out my
Right.
40 to 50 hours a week, but I could focus. I had the freedom to focus on Guardian because that was my
Nice.
ultimate plan, right? And Brian and Kyle end up getting called to go on the set at Shark Tank. They go on, do a handshake deal with Mark Cuban, and
Mm-hmm.
come back and say, "Hey, John, we did a handshake deal with Mark Cuban. We need to get this deal closed, and once we do, we're going to bring you on full time." And so
Right.
it had been going on by the time I started full time, which I believe could be slightly off on this, but I think it was in 2016, at the end of
Mm-hmm.
2016. I
Mm-hmm.
had already been working with Brian for 7 years part
Wow.
time. So the plan was
Wow.
always to come on full time, and we finally got enough capital when we closed the deal with Mark Cuban, and that's when I joined full time.
Wow. That's a story. That's a story in itself. So what some people don't realize, kind of the what happens after Shark Tank for a company.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Brian, being the very clear and astute strategic thinker
Mm-hmm.
that he is, before we ever even went on, this is where it starts. Before the company ever even went on Shark Tank, he spent a bunch of time researching which sharks actually close the deals in real life. Because when you leave the set, it's just a handshake, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and he found that about half the deals that get made on set, regardless of the shark, don't close in real life.
Oh wow. I didn't know
But
that.
but what he did find is that Mark Cuban closes the
Mm-hmm.
most deals in real life out of every
Mm.
shark. And so we researched like news articles to get this information. Brian found a bunch of companies that he knew did and didn't close a deal with Mark from previous seasons, and
Right.
like reached out to them on LinkedIn and got them on calls and asked
Oh
them.
wow.
And so going in, Brian had already decided Mark is the guy we want, right?
Yeah.
Like that is the one we want. I'm not
Mhm.
even sure if we would do a deal with the other sharks or not. And so he already had a plan going in to work with Mark. And after after literally within a week after the show, we
Mhm.
got kind of the draft term sheet and
Mhm.
transaction agreements. But for us, so a lot of brands, what we found out is that a lot of brands are not very sophisticated that go on Shark Tank. They don't already have capital. Most of them don't have a CFO. Brian's also a very strategic. He has a finance background as well. So we came
Yeah.
in with a lot of finance background, and we had already raised 7 figures in equity capital
Mhm.
before this from a sophisticated investor. So we had
Yeah.
to like thread the needle between our different investors to make sure everything jived and everything. So it actually took us 11 months to get the deal closed in
Oh
real
wow.
life.
That's a lot of like I could just imagine as an entrepreneur feeling like on top of the world and then just having to like maintain the faith for 11 months. That seems hard.
When we had to still focus on running the business, growing the business, we still had to raise our own capital in the
Mhm.
meantime because we were venture backed at that point, not by any big VC firms, venture backed by like angel investors, right?
Mhm.
No
Mhm.
institutional money, but sophisticated high net worth individuals.
Right.
So the thing about these deals, they go slow. You do a turn of your red lines, and you maybe 2 weeks before you hear back because
Yeah.
Mark's guys are also working on how many other deals, right?
Right.
And so it really took 11 months because just every time you have comments or requests for edits, it's got to get approved by our board. It's got to get approved by their legal guys. So like it took us. There were times when we were stressing over threading the needle between closing Mark's deal and running the business that we already had at that
Right.
time, right? And so
Mhm.
it definitely was stressful, and there were times when we didn't know if we would be able to get everyone on the same page or not.
Right. Right. So again, like when did the episode air and what was
Yeah.
that like operationally for you when it aired?
Oh my gosh, dude. That's one of those experiences that whenever I meet someone else who
Yeah.
works for a company that's been on Shark Tank, we can
Yeah.
kind of like instant camaraderie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's so many questions. Like, so luckily for us, we closed the deal with Mark like 4 months before we aired. We aired in
Okay.
April of 2017. And so what do you think are the first questions that you ask yourself, right? Like if Fresh Chili was going to be on Shark Tank, the first question
Yeah.
would be like, how much inventory should we order,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
and
Yeah.
and like we want to go big enough that we don't miss out on sales, but
Right.
we don't want to go so big that we end up with all of our cash tied up on the balance sheet in the form of stale
Right.
inventory. And so
Right.
luckily we had closed a deal with Mark and we were able to start talking with his team a bit about what to expect because they have a bunch of other Shark Tank
Right.
companies who've gone through the same thing. And it was still stressful. We were,
Mm-hmm.
in the end, for the initial airing, we
Yeah.
bought a little too much inventory.
Mm.
Um, what we learned, and in hindsight, this seems simple, but in the moment,
Yeah.
we didn't know, right? Like,
Yeah.
in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. If you have a impulse buy product that's
Mm-hmm.
$9.99, $19.99, maybe
Right.
$39.99. On the night it airs, stuff flies off the shelf, right?
Right.
We have a premium kids bike that's a few hundred
Mm-hmm.
bucks. Did sales spike that day? Yes,
Right.
but we did not have our whole year was made in one night, right? Because
Right.
people are going on and going like, you don't just impulse buy an expensive bike for your kids. What we
Right.
learned thereafter was people buy bikes for Christmas or Hanukkah
Mm-hmm.
or birthdays for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a seasonal spike with the summer, but generally those big events. And
Yeah.
so some of the lessons, one, we learned email capture is so important, right? Because
Mm.
you know what we did have? We had a massive spike in traffic to the website.
That's
And
awesome.
so if you don't capture emails that night that you have that massive spike, those people are gone forever. You never get a
Right.
chance to re-engage them, right? So
Right.
we learned capture emails so that you can send them through an email flow afterwards. And so you can check in on birthdays, Christmas, that kind of
Right.
stuff. And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it was, so I would say like it was a huge event for us. And still to this day, the brand gets tons of recognition. Brian and Kyle have been back on since then for like an update.
Oh, nice.
But we would get, truth be told, not it wasn't like a game-changing night that night we aired. It was like we've heard for years and years since then, I found you on Shark Tank, right?
Yeah.
But maybe bought 3 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. The consideration cycle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Cool. So let's talk about why CFOs should understand marketing, and
Mm.
especially why is that important for like e-commerce brands?
Okay. So plain and simple. Now, keep in mind, I'm biased because I run a CFO firm that just works exclusively with fast-growing bootstrap D2C brands, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is the way I explain it to my team at Free to Grow CFO. I say, hey guys,
Okay.
what makes ecom uniquely ecom in the
Mm-hmm.
finance world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, probably the most unique, the most truly ecom finance thing that exists is understanding the profitability of marketing investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is general CPG finance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't understand direct to consumer marketing or
Mm-hmm.
e-commerce ad spend,
Right.
you can't call yourself an e-com CFO, or at least I don't think you can. You can just call yourself a regular CFO who's trying to
Right.
do e-com. And so
Mm-hmm.
if we're going to call ourselves a firm that is the best in D2C, then we better
Right.
be the best at understanding the profitability of marketing, or else we are just a general CFO firm and we're not vertical specific in D2C.
Mm-hmm. So an issue that I kind of have, as you know, with like problems that I've had in different businesses is like they understand a ROAS mindset, But how do you help them understand a contribution margin mindset? Because I still fight this battle today
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
partnerships.
For sure, man. And I'll be completely honest. We've gotten even better at it since we first started working with Fresh Chili, like, over a year ago. What we've realized is that the starting point is actually breaking up the profitability. When I say profitability, I'm talking about contribution margin profitability of new customers versus returning customers, because they do not have the same unit economic structure. The way that we look at it at Free to Grow is that we attribute 100% of ad spend to new customers, because even though you may exclude, or even though there's some halo effect, right, on returning
That's a good
customers.
way to look at it. Yeah, that's a light bulb for me too.
Yeah, it's something we recently started doing about 6 months ago. Light bulb went off for me when I was doing our CFO audits. I run all of our sales, and part of our process is do a CFO audit, just like I did for you guys. And I started realizing there's two different, I've known this intuitively, but I started seeing in the numbers. There's a difference between a brand that has meaningful repeat purchase and a brand that doesn't have meaningful repeat purchase. And so then I started asking myself, what is meaningful? And here's what I found. What I found is that the most quoted metric for repeat purchase that I found talking to brands is Shopify's returning customer rate. And here's what, but I started looking into the cohort data in Shopify, which actually shows dollars, not the returning customer rate. I've come to the conclusion is actually very misleading, because it's just a percentage of the number of customers as a percentage of returning versus new. And it doesn't really tell you how much they spend, right?
And that's what I care about. I want to know returning dollars, not necessarily customers, right?
So I started digging into it through the lens of the cohort data that is in Shopify, but then also through the lens of the actual monthly, some of the exports you can do of new customer sales versus returning customer sales. And here's what I started finding. I started finding brands that had like a 40% returning customer rate, with almost no meaningful returning customer dollars. And even really worse, not meaningful returning customer contribution margin dollars. And I was like, okay, hold on. This is a huge problem. This brand thinks, man, we've got healthy repeat purchase. And I'm like, you don't. And so what we have started to do is say, new customer profitability is new customer sales times your gross margin minus ad spend, whatever that is. And returning customer profit is returning customer sales times your gross margin. Don't subtract ad spend, because it all got allocated to new customers. And so what you're able to do is, one, confirm, do returning customers give us meaningful margin dollars or insignificant margin dollars? But most importantly, you're talking about the ROAS mindset. Forget the store wide, the Shopify wide ROAS. We're done with that. It's what should your new customer ROAS be? New customer ROAS, what's that target? What's the unlock? What's the CAC you can afford? And so we've actually made a major shift in the last 6 months, and it has been a huge, huge unlock for the brands that we work with. And it's been a huge unlock for us as CFOs to be able to, we're not growth marketers. We're not going to push the buttons on Facebook, but we can actually talk to marketers now in a way that is like much more impactful than we've been able to do in the past.
Well, as a marketer, my initial response to what you just said, if you have a high repeat customer rate but low, returning dollars, you're not optimizing for lifetime value on that purchase, it seems like to me.
Totally.
So, for example, I try to get people into a community. I try to get them into a cooking group. I try to optimize in our upsell purchase. I don't do another product. I do memberships, because I want that person to be a customer for, at least another 18, 24 months. And so I'm always optimizing for lifetime value on my end. And that really makes a lot of sense for those that are struggling, who think those are blind metrics. That's interesting. As it kind of leads to kind of my next question, like a financial blind spot, basically, is what it comes to. So what are some other financial blind spots you see, like top 3 whenever you kind of
Yeah.
audit someone's account.
Okay. So the top one, this is becoming the top one. And I'm actually in my content and with leading my team of CFOs, I'm trying to help us all be able to explain this in simpler terms for brand founders to understand. The top one is you actually can't scale as profitably and fast as you might think you can. And here's why. Let me finish that statement. You can't scale as profitably and fast as you think you can unless you have meaningful LTV. And we can now show mathematically why that's the case. And let me explain it.
Right.
And this is why. Let's say you have insignificant returning customer margin dollars, which that's what
Okay.
real LTV is, right? Real LTV is meaningful return customer margin dollars. Let's say you don't have that. What does that mean? That means all your profit has to come from new customers. What does that mean? That means as your CAC goes up as you scale ad spend, which happens because there's a law of diminishing returns as you scale ad spend. As your CAC goes up, guess what happens? All else equal. Your new customer profit per order keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because your CAC keeps going up. What allows brands to get to tens of millions in revenue and scale ad spend fast but still be profitable? That they have meaningful returning customer margin dollars that offset the fact that their new customers keep getting less profitable as they scale. And so the number one blind spot that I've been trying to help brands understand is you will run out of runway at some point if all your profit has to come from new customers, unless you're willing to expand into new channels. So it's like if you're Shopify only, I'm like, hey man, at some point your CAC's going to get so high, you will not be profitable anymore in new customers, meaning you won't be profitable at all because you don't have meaningful returning customer margin dollars, which means you have to go to Amazon probably next, where you can get your CAC to come down, and then eventually physical retail.
What is that number? Like 10 million? Are you on average?
It depends. Here's what I'm realizing it depends on. It depends on your gross margin dollars per order. So for example, if you have a product that's $50 first order AOV and they have $20 of gross margin on that order, it's going to happen sooner than the brand that has $200 of AOV and $100 of gross margin. And it's because one of those starts breaking even at a $20 CAC and the other one at a $100 CAC. And the one that can break even at a $100 CAC has more runway to scale ad spend, right? And so it depends on how many margin dollars you have available to cover an increase in CAC. Depends on how much competition you have in your ad channels, and it depends on how much demand there is for your product category. But I will say, for an average brand, I see it happen. I've seen it happen at between 15 and 30 million in revenue on a Shopify only brand, roughly.
But that's a good position to be at because, I mean, at that point, you're probably looking to take on investment or strategic distribution or whatever it may be. So, all right, that's cool. Did you define the other two blind spots?
Yeah, so the other two, so first is how fast and profitable you can scale. The second one is where your cash is locked up. A lot of brands, they know their P&L cold, but they don't know their balance sheet. And so they don't see that their cash is tied up in vendor payments and inventory. And then the third thing is just a blind spot of not even understanding how inaccurate their bookkeeping is. And that by having such inaccurate bookkeeping, they can't even make assessments of what they should and shouldn't do because they have very messy bookkeeping in the first place.
I think that's 90% of it's just messy. Hopefully AI cleans that up for us. Hopefully.
Yeah, I mean there's some good progress there. There's still a lot of room to go, but there has definitely been some progress.
All right. So what made you start Free to Grow CFO, and kind of what do you think sets you apart in the marketplace today?
Yeah, so truth be told, I had been with Guardian Bikes, so this is 2021. Guardian gone through a couple of very challenging years. It's always challenging scaling a brand, but I came out of 2021 after COVID and dealing with supply chain madness and was just like, and we were scaling really fast, and we had grown from the three of us, me, Brian, and Kyle, to 35 people. And I was just like, man, along the way, I had become a Christian. I met Jesus. and I started having kids. I, at the time, had 2 little kids, and my wife was pregnant with a third. And I just really started feeling God impress upon my heart, like, there's more to business than just scaling, right? There's impact on people, on souls, right? And so I started praying. It just took me like a year. I started praying over, like, what does it look like to impact souls in business? Now, keep in mind, I was doing this with every ounce of my being that I could at Guardian Bikes, but Guardian Bikes was not all my company. I own a small portion of Guardian. I was a second in command, right? And I got to hone my skills of leadership and treating people well, but I didn't get to have full control over guiding principles and impact, right? And so I started feeling like, hey, you're supposed to start your own thing. And I'm like, okay, but like what? Right. And so I had read, this is a true story. I'm looking over at the Bible that I have notes in it about this. I was sitting on my back porch in 2021, and I'd been going back and forth. My wife was probably just tired of me saying, like, I'm going to leave Guardian, I'm going to start my own thing. No, I'm not. I can't do that. And I was reading Genesis chapter 12, where for those of you who don't know, paraphrase, God calls Abraham out of his homeland and calls him into what he tells him is going to be the promised land. And what stuck out at me was, it says that he left with all of his possessions and all of his family, right? And he followed God. Just God told him to go somewhere, and he's like, all right. And I'm thinking to myself, this is what it looks like to follow God, is that, like, he doesn't know where he's going. And quite frankly, the promise that was made to him was very vague. It just said that, you know, like, I'm going to make you into a great nation, right? And I'm going to bless you. And he it doesn't say he fought back with God. There's even stories of Moses, like, saying, no, don't choose me, choose someone else. It doesn't say Abraham said that. It said that Abraham just did it, right? And I was like, okay, this is what this looks like, right? And so this is a true story. I don't think I've ever told this full story, what I'm about to tell you right now, ever in my content. And so I read that, and I was like, hey, I think I'm getting the call. And so I started praying over it. I made a bunch of notes. I was like, I'm supposed to follow God. It doesn't matter where he's going to take me. I just need to trust him, right? And one of my buddies called me a couple days later and was like, hey, man, let's meet up for a beer. And he's someone who had worked with me at Guardian Bikes before, but he's an entrepreneur and had his own thing. And so he didn't work with us anymore. But I met up with him for a beer, and I get there, and there's zero exaggeration in this story. He goes, we sit down. I haven't seen him in a few months. And he goes, Jon, why don't you start your own business? And I was like, by the way, I had not told him about this because we are mutual friends. We're mutual friends with the other guys on the founding team of Guardian Bikes. So I purposely hid this from him. And he goes, Jon, you know you need to start your own business. You know you're ready. And like, he goes, dude, I used to work for you. Like, you're going to kill it, and people are going to love whatever you do. You need to go do this.
Wow.
And my heart just kind of like started pounding, and I was thinking to myself, I just read this in Genesis chapter 12 and felt like God calling me to do this. And here I am sitting with my buddy who doesn't know anything that I've been wrestling with this for a year. And he tells me, you need to start your business, man. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so anyways, I started praying, is this it? Is this the call? Like, this is crazy. And I called an Uber to pick me up because me and my wife share one car, and I didn't have the car. And I get in the Uber, and this is not a lie. One of my favorite worship songs of all time is playing in the Uber.
Yeah.
And I just felt this peace, like I felt like that was God saying, yes, I'm going to give you a third sign. I gave it to you in Genesis chapter 12. Your friend just told you out of the blue, you need to start your business, and he knew nothing about this. And when you prayed to me while you're waiting for that Uber, and you got in and you heard one of your favorite worship songs, that was me saying, yes, I'm calling you into this. And I got the goosebumps. I came home. I woke my wife up.
Same right now.
And I was like, God's calling me to start this business. I don't know what it's going to be. And I sat down the next day and pulled out an EOS VTO because I'm an EOS guy. And at the top is your core values. and
Mm-hmm.
it's your purpose. And I wrote down the 5 core values that the company has to this day. And I wrote down the purpose of this business is going to be to build a profitable business that truly cares for people. And that was the beginning of Free to Grow CFO. And over the course of the next several months, I replaced myself at Guardian Bikes. I took 2 months off for a sabbatical to just gather my thoughts. And on February 17th, 2022, I started Free to Grow CFO. And it was just me, and it was like, I'm just going to be a consultant. And I loaded every phone number that I had into Pipedrive CRM, and I set a goal that I'm going to make 10 phone calls a day. And I made 10 phone calls a day for like 2 months, and 4 months later, all of a sudden I was at full capacity, and I couldn't take on any more clients. And I was like, all right, God's blessing this. It's time to scale it. And that's the beginnings of this is a true story never told in public. My pastor knows this because I called him and told him when this all happened, was like, is this Pastor Matt, is this God talking to me? And he's like, I think so, dude. Like, if there's any time that God's talking to you, it's now. And so I've never had an experience like that with God before, but that's why I'm so convicted that I can never stop doing this business until I feel God clearly pulling me in another direction, because it's the one time in my life that he spoke to me so clearly.
That's awesome. I mean, yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's why it's called Share Your Story, so that's awesome. Wow, that was definitely a clear sign. Talk about, say a founder, reaches out to you. Obviously, I know when we reached out, we didn't understand our books, our P&L, our inventory, didn't understand ROAS, contribution margin. I mean, and they want to grow. They're coming to you to grow because you're called Free to Grow CFO. What do those conversations look like? How do you kind of help them know when to cut spend or double down?
For sure. So these days, where it starts is hey, here's what we need to do to your accounting first and foremost, so that we can get just accurate baseline data to make decisions on, right? Once we have that, step 2 is like being very honest about what the repeat purchase profile looks like in the business. And to be clear, we talk about margin dollars. We don't care about returning customer rate. We don't care about lifetime value in revenue terms. We care about lifetime value in margin dollar terms, because that's what unlocks more profitable scale. And then usually we're also just talking about very candidly about, hey, is your overhead too high? Right? Like, are you holding too much inventory? And so like growth, what we're realizing growth is really about in e-com, and specifically D2C, but definitely just e-com in general. Growth is about having a brand. And part of being a brand is that people want to come back and purchase from you again. Like I always say, if you have a brand where someone only purchases once, is it even a brand? Because a brand is something like, dude, North Face, Patagonia. As soon as this thing wears out, I'm buying another one of these. And I was looking at Patagonia shirts this morning because this one is about like worn out, right? It's got a hole that you can't see, but I'm wearing it because I love it so much. That's a brand. Is like, I'm going to buy another Patagonia shirt, right? As soon as I need another one. And so the brands that we're starting to realize, the brands that run into trouble, candidly, they don't have repeat purchase. And so they just eventually you run out, you run to the end of the line, right? And there just isn't more value to extract or meaningful value to extract from the marketplace. And so there's a lot of candid conversations about that. And there's also a lot of candid conversations about how much can you afford to pay yourself, right? And recently we've been blessed with being able to work with bigger and bigger brands as we gain more of a name in the space. Recently we've been able to have a lot of fun conversations about like, pay yourself more. You're being too, I know that like you bootstrap this thing, right? And so like you're fearful over like it running out of cash, but like you're doing well and you now have a CFO, and I can show you why it's healthy to pay yourself more now,
Right.
and so those are
That's
some
a
of the
fun one.
common conversations we're having when it comes to growth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So, what would you tell a founder who's stuck chasing revenue and not seeing any profit?
Okay, so first thing is like sit down and really figure out, like really question if
Mm-hmm.
your margins are scalable. And that's not
Mm-hmm.
just um it's not just a percentage. In fact, it's not even really a percentage like standpoint that matters. Percentage does
Mm-hmm.
matter. The higher percentage, the better, right? Percentage of revenue. What matters is
Mm-hmm.
dollars. Because I'll
Mm-hmm.
give you an example. Do you have a product that has a 80% margin, but the AOV is so low that that's only $10? That
Mm-hmm.
$10, I'm sorry, unless someone buys every couple weeks from you,
Right.
that it's not going to scale. And so like the first thing is like really ask yourself how many margin dollars per order, gross margin dollars per order you can
Mm-hmm.
actually generate, and be honest with yourself about that. And I would say
That's great
the
advice.
next thing is is ask yourself, like, does your whoever's spending your ad dollars, do they
Mm-hmm.
really get the connection to profitability? And
Yeah,
that
that's a
means
tough
not
one.
just the ROAS, like the blended ROAS for a channel or
Right.
for the business. It's like, do they understand how profitable a new customer is? There are
Mm-hmm.
good agencies who get that, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so those are kind of like some of the first couple things. And then after that, if you have healthy gross margin dollars and your
Mm-hmm.
advertising people like get it, then you have to ask yourself, are you bloated on overhead, fixed overhead?
Right.
And do you have to
Mm-hmm.
make some hard decisions on cutting fixed overhead to get
Mm-hmm.
that number down so you can turn a profit?
No, I love that. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story today, especially sharing one that you've never shared publicly ever before. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're interested in more helpful tips on how to scale a D2C brand profitably, definitely consider following me on LinkedIn. That's Jon Blair. And then if you're interested in learning more about how Free to Grow CFO can help you scale your brand, freetogrowcfo.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for Sinlane for sponsoring this episode. And again, check out Jon Blair. He's given me a lot of clarity. I can't tell you the amount of opportunity that we had working with Jon. It really was unlocked for me on the marketing side to really understand the accounting side of our business. And I mean, I think I posted the numbers today. I think we're up 83% year over year.
Love it,
So
man.
yeah,
That makes
but
that makes my
when
heart
you
happy.
understand it,
Yeah,
so
I love it,
I
dude.
appreciate you a lot, and thanks so much for being on this episode.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me.